people want to turn to solar and wind and other things to help the environment. Environmental impact matters. I look at this and I think if they put a windmill up with a monopole, it takes up the space of the pole. If they put a floating turbine up with anchor lines running in 4 different directions, it takes up 2 to 4 square miles. Is that environmental impact being taken into account? Not to mention the maintenance issues you're going to have getting to and from the windmills when you move them offshore like that in weather. I know that you're not going to fly people into a windmill by helicopter, and I know you're not going to put a boat alongside when it's blowing 35 or more. And they want to put the windmills where they say the most wind is. So just getting to work on these things is going to be difficult. I'm sure they have a plan for it. I don't know what it is. I know what weather I can go in and I can't go in. If you put it on land, you get to it. You don't have to run cable underwater. There's a lot of other things you can do when you put these on land. But people can see them and hear them.
If we go to floating, obviously floating is going to enable sites that are further from shore, out of sight, and better wind, and in many cases much less conflicted.
These turbines can be placed beyond the horizon, 20 or 30 miles offshore, so they can't be seen from land.
We are the only opposition. About 5,000 of us. How many people do they have to have a debate with if they decided to put them out in the end of Cape Elizabeth near two lights? I bet they wouldn't get very far when the lawyers got done with them. It probably would produce just as much energy at a lower cost of construction and a lower cost of transmission. People don't want them where they can see them, and they can't see them if they go that far offshore.
The industrialized floating offshore wind foundation technologies. And by that we mean setting ourselves up for mass production so that these systems can be deployed in larger numbers.
That's Walt, a senior engineer from the U.S. Department of Energy who has been partnering with energy corporations in their venture to industrialize the Gulf of Maine. As you can tell, the initial research array is nothing compared to their ultimate plans for filling the oceans with these things. An oceanographer in Stonington, Maine was gracious enough to share her thoughts with me last summer on the issues at hand.
I'm Dr. Carla Guenther. I'm the chief scientist at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries here in Stonington, Maine. I've been here since 2010 upon finishing my PhD in oceanography and fisheries management in California. I started out as a biologist, as a genetics biologist. In college, I discovered sea kayaking. And here along the coast of Maine, I became a Maine registered guide. I led trips right here out of Stonington, and then found my way traveling through Alaska and Mexico and California as a kayaking guide. And in each of those places, I would see the fishermen. I would buy product off of their boats so that we could serve it with our guests. I trained Mexican fishermen in some English and working with American tourists. And it inspired me to think more about that interaction, that human natural world connection, and those interactions and the interdependence and the interplay between them. So I went on to pursue my interdisciplinary PhD, and it's really, truly the way to approach our complex problems of the world. As the human population grows larger, as we are needier on our resources, we need some technology in our solutions, but there are also some social solutions that we can be looking toward. There's also traditional knowledge held within those relationships that have been generated that we could harness, that we could understand better, so that we can plan better about how to interact or construct, if you will, in our natural environment. So I come here to the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries to be a translator between fishermen and the scientists and policymakers. So we're all starting to kind of speak similar languages, and they can start to understand the perspectives, the multiple perspectives, so that we can tease apart that complex problem and come together with solutions. At the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, we're about preserving a fishing future for eastern Maine. And that goal and the development of offshore renewable energy in Maine could be at a juxtaposition. I'm a climate scientist. We believe that climate change is happening. We are seeing those effects in our fisheries. We're seeing those effects along the shoreline here in our infrastructure. There's definitely a need for reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, but is industrialization of the Gulf of Maine the outstanding opportunity? Is this where we are? Our position is precisely to say, let's review all of the opportunities for different renewable energy options. Unfortunately, much of the conversation has been emotional at this point, at this juncture, on both sides. There is this sort of visceral, we need it now, or we don't need it at all. Both sides are very understandable, I'd say. However, we need to start talking like brass tacks. We need to start talking real information. When the benefits of wind power are being put forward, they're really not necessarily intangible. They're just not brought down to a point of saying, okay, well, how many of these jobs really, and what jobs are they? And is it just in construction and then it goes away? And so what are we really talking about here? And is job one equivalent to 3 jobs on the water? We just aren't talking with real hard and fact numbers, and understandably maybe we can't get there, but let's try. And so then the fishermen also have all of their reasons for why we shouldn't do it. Maybe some of those are more emotional, maybe they are not as supported by information. Their gut instinct, gut reaction, and that's fine too, but let's figure it out. Let's do a little bit of research. It's completely reasonable to think that these offshore turbines are going to be noisy underwater for all of these critters that use sonar to navigate, especially one that we are bending over backwards to try to preserve with its very low numbers.
You heard right. Floating wind turbines could pose serious dangers to North Atlantic right whales. And this is one of the main reasons that lobstermen are so skeptical about talks of reducing their risk to right whales, because they're not encountering right whales, and yet they're being steadily excluded from their fishing grounds on that pretext. And meanwhile, government agencies roll out the red carpet for their own pet projects, which ironically pose a much more realistic risk to right whales. That's a subject we'll be going into more detail on in the future.
So we really need to be thinking, okay, why is there so much pressure to put this when we're also having to remove this? We need to just have real numbers. Let's not be talking about anything in the abstract.
So that's Dr. Guenther, oceanographer, climatologist. She's working on a variety of issues that impact coastal communities, yet she's not seen evidence that offshore wind development is anywhere near being the clear-cut solution to climate change that wind lobbyists are touting it as. We're going to hear more from Dr. Guenther later, but I'd like to briefly touch on what is, as of the moment, the only negative comment I have received on this series so far, from a YouTube user who claims to be an oceanographer who left a rant for me on episode 1. I'm just going to draw your attention to a couple parts for now. Great quality of production. However, the amount of misinformation in this video is honestly astounding and disturbing. The fear-mongering is disgusting and unproductive for society. As a professional oceanographer, and someone who has spent his entire professional career working towards climate and humanity improving projects, including offshore wind, this is completely ass-backward thinking, misleading, and ignorant. The environment, fisheries, fishermen, and job growth are top priorities for offshore wind development. Whoever produced this has created a one-sided, polarizing piece. No experts or voice from the other side of the dialogue are presented, just more misinformed anti-wind rhetoric. Golly, think for yourself and do some actual research. This is pathetic and honestly upsetting. For info, I grew up going to Maine, love the people, am friends with and advocate of Maine lobstermen, and maintain a house there for over 40 years. Now, this guy may or may not be an actual oceanographer, I don't know. If he is, I hope he watches this video so Dr. Guenther can teach him about some of the drawbacks to industrializing the Gulf of Maine that he's either unacquainted with or is overlooking because he's getting paid to help plan the development. But of course, it's nice to know that ocean exploration loves the people in Maine, is friends with lobstermen and advocates for them, although I wonder if his lobsterman friends know that he considers them to be ass-backwards and ignorant in their misinformed, anti-wind rhetoric. I will grant him one point though, because I have been referring to floating windmills from time to time, and I was wrong about that. The correct terminology, according to Senator Angus King, is
Wind Ranch.
remember to call them wind ranches. Now back to more of my ass backwards interviews. Steve Train did a great job shedding some more light on what Maine's fisheries and communities would look like if the Gulf of Maine were industrialized.
Hi, my name's Steve Train. I'm a commercial fisherman, primarily lobster, from the town of Long Island, Maine. It's an unbridged island in Casco Bay. I've got a lot of family heritage in lobstering. My father was in it and got out of it. My grandfather was a fisherman his whole life, and he tapered down to lobstering later on. Both sides of my father's family had fishing background that goes way back on the island. I started out in a skiff when I was 7 or 8 years old and worked my way up into a 40-foot boat by the time I was 14 years old as a stern man. I did that for high school and the first couple of years of college, and then I bought my own boat my third year of college. And so I've been in my own boat ever since. When I started, we didn't have lines in the ocean, for one. We could go pretty much anywhere we wanted as long as we behaved ourselves and got along with our neighbors. There's still certain places you didn't go because you know you didn't belong there, but as a whole, especially as you worked off, you could go anywhere you wanted the further offshore you got. Between placards we need to keep aboard saying we know what a whale is, or gear regulations we have to abide by now, colors in our buoy lines, breakaway strength on things. There's a lot more to it, and there's a lot of hard work involved in lobstering. The hardest part usually isn't on the water. I mean, especially summer lobstering, I call it a working vacation. Our days are short, our gear is near shore, the weather is good, and I've got a job that's a lot of fun. In the wintertime, it gets a lot more like work. You know, then we go from 8 or 9 hour days to 12 and 14 hour days. We have a little more days off. We have to deal with the weather. We have to deal with icing issues. And then it's the days you're not on the water when you're working. The non-paid days when you're really working, when you're patching traps, moving gear around, counting out ropes, splicing, building buoys, etc. Not to mention the paperwork we have to do now. The fishermen in the state of Maine are very fortunate that the lobster fishery has been managed as well as it has. There's more people in the fishery. We're fishing longer into the year than we used to, and this fishery can sustain it. And it's a good thing because most of the fishermen in the state of Maine have been pigeonholed into one fishery. You know, we used to be able to go ground fishing, scalloping, sea urchin, and shrimping. With the change in the climate that we've witnessed, the shrimp aren't here. You know, we're not going to see the shrimp with the bottom temperatures that we're seeing. Scalloping is limited. The federal permits on ground fish are done. You can buy one, but there's still only a limited number of them. Most of the fish quota is owned by big companies. It's not the way it was when we started, but what we've got left is lobstering. The proposed wind projects of floating turbines offshore in the Gulf of Maine are being proposed for an obvious benefit. When you see fishermen like me speaking against these turbines, it's not that we don't care about climate change, but we do care about our livelihood. If you went into LL Bean and said, I'm going to put a windmill in this corner of the store where you sell the guns, you'll just have to sell them somewhere else from now on. The store's already being used. There isn't another place, and that's the lobster fishery. You know, or I'm going to put a windmill in your backyard where your pool is. You'll just have to go use your neighbor's pool from now on. You know, your neighbor might not appreciate that. And essentially, that's what they're doing to us. I know this is where you fish. You can go somewhere else now. We're going to put a wind farm here. And people seem to think, well, you can go somewhere else. There's only lobsters certain places. I mean, one of the areas they're proposing now for this experimental lease is one of the most productive spring fisheries for lobsters in the state of Maine. You don't go somewhere else and catch something. And especially the lobster fishery is a very territorial fishery. You know, you can't say, well, we're just going to take this 16 square miles, they can go somewhere else. It doesn't work like that. You don't get to go somewhere else. There's already somebody there, you know. There's a reason why you were where you were. I know they've asked lobstermen and other fishermen to come to the table for discussions on this. I honestly think it's to say they had them involved because I don't think they've listened one bit to us. If they had, they'd be making some changes.
That's why I really think that had we been able to do this roadmap in a trusting kind of way over the last, if we'd started a year ago and we're going into a 3-year thing without any assumptions that we're going to put wind turbines in the ocean, we'd be in a much better place.
This has only been done one other place, so this is an experiment.
There are well-intended people trying to make things happen in the world who think of outreach as a one-way conversation. I'm here to tell you what I know, and you should listen to me. And at the end of this, we'll have a little bit of Q&A, and then I'm going to go. And they'll check that box and consider that to be outreach and engagement. I've experienced this through my whole career, and it frustrates the hell out of me. And I just know that's false. I've seen this, I've played this game. You can't do these complex conversations once. You have to evolve the conversation, listen to the questions and concerns, even if you know the answer. As a scientist, a researcher, you should keep that answer in your back pocket and just listen and learn through those conversations. And over time, if there's trust, you can bring information into that conversation that's helpful and not polarizing, and you may maintain a collaborative approach. And fishermen may not like the answers that come out of that, but if they were engaged in that conversation over a period of time and felt like they were being listened to, and they're listening and learning, then isn't that essential for any of these complex problems on the planet? That's what our little organization is trying to do in our own little way with some of our studies. We're not big enough to make that paradigm real in a statewide sense. I'm disappointed the roadmap has been put aside, because that could actually answer a lot of questions, and it may make a convincing case that this is something we need to do in the United States. But I'm not so sure we've made that case across the spectrum of natural science and engineering and the social economic element of creating and moving and using power.
As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, the offshore wind roadmap was finally resumed a few months after I interviewed Paul about this whole situation. And I know that everyone within the Fisheries Working Group is hopeful that their input will be able to make a difference, and that the end result of the roadmap will be in the best interests of the future of Maine fishermen and the place they call home. I asked Dr. Guenther for her impression of the experience that locals have had with the push for offshore wind.
Primarily the way I would characterize and have characterized this process is a pendulum swing. So there's a lot of whiplash with among the coastal communities, among fishermen. While some people might think that this shouldn't be a surprise that we're talking about this, Senator Angus King, when he was governor, he was quoted to say that Gulf of Maine is the Saudi Arabia of wind. So we have known for a good 20, 25, maybe even 30 years that the Gulf of Maine has been a target of offshore wind development. It's still not a tested technology to see how effective that offshore wind may be. And it's just, wind power in general is fairly inefficient. It's very expensive per kilowatt hour.
We fully expect to see large-scale deployments in the late 2020s. And on this basis, we firmly believe floating can be competitive with other sources of energy by the end of the decade.
It might be more expensive to end users, but the offshore wind proponents are confident that their business models will become viable once they rake in some massive subsidies.
Large-scale offshore wind is achievable, but it is based on high-level policy backing.
I think we are going to need states to commit to procurement opportunities.
The industry is awash in tax credits. Our projects are so big, it's a little bit hard to digest tax credits. The old-style cash grant sure would be very helpful to get floating offshore wind industry off the ground.
I would second what Chris mentioned earlier. It really comes down to that cash grant. The cash grant is an excellent way to jumpstart the industry. And on the state level, mandates to allow us to enter into contracts with creditworthy counterparties to push the industry forward.
Good old corporate welfare. It warms the heart. Once these companies get a nice advance of your tax dollars, then they'll cram as many of these turbines into the Gulf of Maine as they possibly can to maximize that profit margin.
As we move to commercialization and cost reduction, we have pretty much, these are the two pathways that the industry seems to be following right now. And there's a very strong push for the second pathway, the design for industrialization. We're never going to reach our cost goals if we can't industrialize those systems that we're developing and adapt them for the ports that we need, and speed up the assembly process, and mass produce the components that are made, and make sure that we can make them locally near the ports where they're being assembled.
Federal policymakers can get more action-oriented on offshore wind infrastructure. If we take 5 years to develop ports and then start building projects will be at this for a generation.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. If we're gonna urbanize the ocean, let's not take our time to work on it carefully. This guy wants his wind ranches and he wants them now. And I'm sure his primary motivator is how much he cares about the environment. Certainly he's not just eyeing a bonus for fast-tracking development so that he can add some Hawaiian vacation properties to his real estate portfolio. Because you know coastal Maine probably won't be as nice of a retirement spot with all those pesky, unemployed fishermen on shore just harshing your buzz. But my own speculations aside, listen to any of these guys talk at length about their projects, and it becomes clear that they are hell-bent on scaling up the development way larger than the initial research array.
Really, that efficiency of scale maybe doesn't even operate well in Maine just because of the shape of our coastline. You don't have an efficiency of scale because we are all these tiny little peninsulas off of the main drag, and we've had to develop a recalcitrant, hardy independence at each of the tips of those peninsulas or islands. And so trying to make us fit into some other uniform, homogenized, whatever word you want to use for it, type of approach just it won't work here. It's not the Maine way. We are the two single most fishing dependent counties on the eastern seaboard here in Hancock and Washington. And we have a very large dependence, an unhealthy dependence on lobster. We've lost many of our other fisheries. We still have kind of a rebounding scallop fishery, but no access to it. There are other opportunities, but we're really, really holding on to lobster pretty tightly, and we need to be thinking about expanding what that is. I'd like to think that southern species with climate change were bringing more opportunities, but I think honestly the timelines of these external threats to the resilience of lobster will be challenged between wind development and between the whale rule options. We're looking at those things happening sooner than access can be developed for harvesting any species from the south. So I think we are looking at a sea change, but I don't think we can completely switch from one to the other. It's just completely unrealistic to think that wind is going to replace the economic engine that we currently have here in Maine. I would say that renewable energy is a noble and valuable pursuit, just not seeing that the trade-offs with offshore wind development are providing the pros to outweigh the cons. We're not really seeing that. We're not seeing the scale and balance. We don't have a lot of data yet. While it's a really cool technology that we may be developing, that we house here and have developed here in Maine, and it's great, should we? Just because we can, should we? And I just feel like maybe let's take a pause, let's take a breather. Let's proceed with some caution and with some knowledge. And there just may be, if we were to peruse the horizon of available technologies and how much development there has been in the past 15 years, while we've had two conservative administrations, both in the gubernatorial office here in the state and at the national level, if we were to just recover from that 8-year, 10-year time gap and just say, what's out there? Maybe offshore wind isn't the thing that's there right now, and we're maybe a little more technology, a little more R&D that we could develop and build something else in its stead.
I'm an islander, and most of the fishermen in the state of Maine don't live in the cities like Portland. There are people there that go fishing. But if you live in one of the peninsula communities in the mid-coast down east, or you live in one of the islands in the state of Maine, you're probably a caretaker, a construction worker, or a fisherman. Fishing is the backbone of many of those communities. The fishermen are the ones that have the kids in the schools, volunteer on the fire department, and keep the store open year-round. Most of the houses and structures in these communities are seasonal. Without the fishing industry, you will lose a big part of these communities. If you can't have a school year-round, your kid will have to ride a bus an hour and a half, 2 hours every day to go to school. You won't be able to shop in the store. You probably won't have a gas station in town. And I can't imagine what your homeowner's insurance is going to be like with no fire department. We're more than just, boats swinging on a mooring and the fresh lobsters you get from your neighbor.
I think it behooves the lobster fishery and these coastal communities to go through kind of a soul-searching process. What is it we really want? What is it we need in order to sustain our independence and our identity? And how do we get there? Because make no mistake, change is coming. And it's not a threat, that just is the way of the world that always has been. We're not getting anywhere if we just say no.
I'm in favor of alternative energies. I think it's a great plan. I've seen what the environmental impacts of fossil fuels. But I'd rather see it in my backyard. I'd rather see it at an elevated point on fixed land. I'd rather see monopoles that are stuck into the shoals and on the ledges so that we can actually fish around them like we could mow around a flagpole.
So one of the tricks about those decisions being made either by government or by the developers and their money, essentially driving this into places like the Gulf of Maine and elsewhere along the Atlantic coast. There's a bunch of these developments that are queued up in areas being defined, areas of interest, that they're going to do that no matter what we learn. And that's troubling, to think that we can't take our time to study the Aquaventus machine carefully, study the one, and find any problems. And if it's a disaster, then great. I'm glad we didn't put more of these out there. If they do the research array, and 20 years from now, they're learning more about aggregate impacts and taking away from fisheries and what's the impact on whales or other parts of the ecosystem. Meanwhile, developers are queuing up huge fields of these machines in the Gulf of Maine, regardless of what the science says, then, that calls into question what this whole situation is for Maine. Maine is a state. We don't have a lot of control in the federal waters unless we play political cards through our congressmen and try to just, say we're not doing this in the Gulf of Maine, like they've done with oil exploration in the past. The Gulf of Maine has been held as, no, we're not going to do that here.
We should avoid industrialization, whether it's aquaculture, whether it's wind, whether it's whatever. We need to maintain consistency with the small scale businesses that are characteristic of this coast. This should be a nonpartisan issue. Unfortunately, it has become incredibly partisan. Like everything actually right now is incredibly partisan. What color my shoelaces are is a representation of what party I affiliate with. So I think that's too bad, because there are real things that should be nonpartisan, that we should be able to seek solutions for. And unfortunately, the future of our children, the future of our planet, the future of our communities and culture all depend on us getting together and figuring it out. Climate change isn't happening any slower either. These transitions are probably going to be more rapid. They're going to over time, but we already saw it in 2012. We're seeing it right now. Buoy I is 6 degrees Celsius warmer on the surface than it has been in any other year since we've been recording data. So it behooves Lobsterman to almost engage, not necessarily saying, hey, yeah, bowl us over with offshore wind development, but we want to stick around for the long haul. We may not look like we've looked over the past century, but we want to still be here. We provide a role to our communities. We provide really good jobs. We provide great opportunities for young people to develop responsibility and become good civil members in society. There aren't opportunities like that in many other places of the world. We've also seen with coronavirus in the past year, we have all of these emigres coming here from other places. There's a desire to live here because we are so different. We are the last vestige of some of those older cultural values that I think largely across the board Americans value. So we have that here. And one of the reasons we do is because lobstering has been able to stave off industrialization of our coastline. Let's continue that. Let's continue this idea of the small scale independent business owner and really continue kind of our way of life and our value system. That doesn't have to be just connected to lobster.
In this episode and the last, I think we've disproved the fallacies that fishermen are completely unfounded in their concerns over the effects of ocean industrialization, as well as the notion that scientists all agree that offshore wind is the best path to save the planet. So I'm thankful that I was able to talk to scientists whose employment doesn't hinge on doing the bidding of the floating wind lobby. So if you want to support a nonprofit that's conducting truly independent scientific research, I don't think you can do better than the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. And as you've been learning about the challenges that Maine's commercial fishermen are up against, if you want to show some support for them, I know they'll appreciate it. You can donate to the Sustainable Maine Fishing Foundation, which is a nonprofit started by the Maine Lobstering Union to preserve the Gulf of Maine. You can visit SaveMaineLobsterman.org, which is overseen by the Maine Lobstermen's Association. Any donations there go towards their goal of raising $10 million to fight the unjust regulations being foisted on Maine lobstermen. There's the Down East Lobstermen's Association, which advocates specifically for the lobstermen down east. And more broadly, there's the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. They're doing innovative work to advance all of Maine's commercial fisheries. So if you're wondering what you can do for Maine fishermen, any one of these organizations could use your help.